Welcome to this special edition of All Clear, a health and wellness podcast for firefighters. Today we'll be listening to a recorded session with Dr. Bryan Ormond from NC State University as he talks about PFAS and turnout gear. This is a very interesting topic, and it directly impacts each and every one of us in our daily jobs. So please enjoy.
My name is Bryan Ormond. I'm an assistant professor at the Wilson College of Textiles at NC State University. I'm jointly appointed in the Textile Protection and Comfort Center. So that's a nonprofit center within the college that we're almost in our 30th year of being a center. We focus on performance, protective clothing, and the trade-offs that exist between protection and other properties such as thermal burden, comfort, in this case, exposure, and protection, things like that. So we were founded, like I said, about 30 years ago, really looking into firefighter protective clothing and equipment first. And so when known Travis for a little while now, I was actually thinking about it, and I think this was one of the last things I came to before COVID. So it was 2020 was the last time I was here. And a lot of stuff has changed since then. We got a lot of different things that we'll talk about. Give you a bit of an agenda, what we're going to try to go through. We'll see if we can get through all of this. But first one that I'll go into is a bit of a controversial topic. So something you may have questions about, may or may not have heard about, right? And so I'll go through talking a little bit about that. And then we have Steve and Russ. Is Craig going to be here? Okay, so Steve and Russ from the Fire Marshal's office talking about extending that PFAS discussion, talking about some of the fluorinated foams and things that we're doing there, working with them and their efforts as well. And then I have two of my postdocs here with me. So Dr. Arjun Chirasi here in the front, and Arash is around here somewhere. But they've been working on these two different areas, one particulate blocking hoods. So Arash will introduce himself when he comes in, but he's also a volunteer firefighter at Northern Wake. And looking at the durability of particulate blocking hoods, we had a whole, I've got links and things to a lot of the reports and stuff that I'll share with you. Arjun has been working on our enhanced cleaning processes. So not just washer extractors, but also liquid CO2, that type of stuff. So we'll go into a little bit of that. And then depending on how much time we have left, we have another project specifically focused on mitigating exposures for fire investigators. We're starting to look at the subpopulation. We typically tend to focus very heavily on structural firefighting. All the research goes there, and then certain things trickle out, looking at wildland firefighters, and we were, identified fire investigators. You have trainers, instructors, all kinds of things that we have to be aware of. So what you'll see a lot of, and one of the things we have, I don't have enough of these printed out, but I have a link to it. But these have a lot of the resources on them for the different things. So there's three independent things there, but you will have a link to that. So jumping in real quick, the biggest topic and what Travis asked me to speak about first was this topic of PFAS in the fire service. So how many people have heard about this issue? How many people have not heard about this issue? Cool. So just one of the things I like to start with, because this is such a controversial topic, there are current lawsuits going on between firefighters, manufacturers. I'd like to give you a perspective of where we are. At the university, we are sitting right in the middle. The Wilson College of Textiles works heavily with industry as well as end users. So we try to bridge that gap and be an impartial, unbiased voice in the middle. And so that's where I sit. I've worked to develop protective clothing with manufacturers. We've worked with firefighters to develop that and bring them together. And so this has been a hard place to be with this kind of discussion because of everything that's going on. But we are not receiving any pay or anything like that from any manufacturers, and these are our opinions based off of the science that's out there, what we've reviewed, what we're doing through our federally funded work, and things like that. And if you have any questions about that, please let me know. But what are PFAS? Is really where I want to start because it's not a topic that you just kind of jump into, and there's a lot of acronyms, a lot of random stuff. You do hear a lot on social media, mainstream media, from the IFF, the union. You hear a lot of things from manufacturers. I'm happy to sort through any of those with you. I've been following this topic for quite a while. Since the day before my first child was born, right? So I got a request from a firefighter back in 2017, and this blog posting had come up, and he was like, "Well, what is this? I don't know what's going on." And so my wife woke up in labor that day and was like, "Oh, we probably need to be getting ready." And I was like, I have to respond to this firefighter real quick. So I wrote that out real fast, explaining some of the issues, some of the background, and what we don't really know just yet at that point. And so I've followed it for the past 6 years, and really started to look for federally funded research that we could start addressing this issue, because there's so many things that you hear, and it's hard to understand, hard to pick up where the truth lies in the middle somewhere. And that's typically where it is. There's a lot of extremes on both sides, but the truth is there in the middle. And I'll try to give that to you. So what are PFAS? Why are they used? PFAS compounds are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So that's what that stands for. PFAS, you would pronounce that PFAS, because there is also a PFAS. So you can see up here basically what these are, and every one of these little intersection points is a carbon atom. I don't want to go through too much chemistry, but just to give you an idea, we have these really large pieces on the end that are fully fluorinated. So every time you have a fluorine here, typically if it's a kind of a natural product like a soap, a fat, a triglyceride, something like that, it's got hydrogens there. So these have been replaced with fluorine. Normally there's 2 additional hydrogens there. Chemists are pretty lazy, so we don't draw everything out every time. But one of the differences, so what the per and poly stands for, per just means every hydrogen has been replaced with a fluorine. With these, it just means many. So some of them are still left, right? So this is just one way to, why it's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These two right here, PFOS or PFAS and PFOA, are the most known about, the most studied. I'll go into why these things were used, where they were, not just where they were used, but why they were used as well. But these two are the most studied because there's previous lawsuits that were put out. They're the most commonly used because one of the things with fluorinated chemistry, it's incredibly good at what it does. They give you very unique, high-performance properties that are hard to replace. And so the problem is, in industry, they found this out and started using them for everything. They are in so many different products that we can talk through. But you have different versions, and it's good to understand, or helpful to understand, when you start seeing these acronyms and things, where they're coming from. And one of the things that you hear about these chemicals is they're called forever chemicals, because they're completely man-made chemicals that don't have really natural degradation pathways in nature or in your body. There's some things, parts of them, it's a class of over 10,000 chemicals. So it's really hard to kind of keep track of. You can't really measure one at a time. So the global scientific community is saying we need to regulate these as a class. Because if we try to keep tracing or chasing every single one to say, okay, this one's bad, now this one's bad, right? Industry just keeps changing to the next one. And so this is just a brief snapshot. One of the things you'll see is, and to keep in mind, these are where things end up. We call them forever chemicals, but every one of them's not. These over here that you'll see can actually break off from some of the finishes that are on gear. These actually will degrade into these. And these are the ones, and another kind of class of those just like that, that are the most persistent. They have really long half-lives in the body, upwards of years, multiple years. It takes them a long time to get out of the body. One of the things, if you know anything about biology or cells or anything like that, they look very similar to the cell lipids, the fat molecules in the cells. And so they can get in and disrupt things. We'll talk a little bit about that. So there's 2 main classes that you really have to think about. So we have non-polymers and polymers. Polymeric PFAS, a polymer in general, is just a very long chain molecule, right? So my background is in textile chemistry, which is really polymer chemistry. So any of your fibers, your fabrics, DNA is a polymer, polyester, polyethylene, all these things where you just build up these units over a really long chain. And that's different from the non-polymers, which are your small molecules. And so within these, you have a couple of breakdowns, and this is typically what we're talking about when we refer to PFAS measured in blood, firefighters' blood, people just in general, not just firefighters. You're measuring for these non-polymeric compounds. However, on the other side, these are some of the things that are actually used in the gear, and I'll show you how. One of the differences between polymers and non-polymers is they have different kind of profiles when you get into biological absorption, things like that. Really large molecules are very difficult to absorb through a cell, into a cell. These are your things like PTFE, so polytetrafluoroethylene, which is like Teflon. They're much larger, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of millions of units as opposed to one molecule. So just to give you an idea of why we use these. So like I said before, the fluorinated chemistries are very unique. What they have is this kind of structure here. So you have this what we call a tail. These are very similar to how detergents are. So you have this tail that wants nothing to do with water. It's hydrophobic. And you have this head on the end of both of them, which has a negative charge, which likes water. So you have this within one molecule, you have something that likes and hates water simultaneously. And so when we have detergents without the fluorine, you have detergents like any laundry detergent that you would use uses the same kind of principle, just without the fluorine. And so because most oily substances that you're trying to clean off of something are not going to want to be in water. So they're going to stay to your fabric. So with detergents, similar to this, you actually form a sphere around that oil. All these tails kind of come together. And then the head's like water, so it rinses off. So that's basically how surfactant chemistry. Arjun will talk a little bit about the cleaning process later. But what this is, it gives you a very unique compound. And so one of the things you'll hear, social media, mainstream media, is that these chemicals are applied to your fabrics for water repellency. That's not entirely true. The reason they're applied is because they give you water repellency, but the main reason is they give you oil repellency as well. So fluorinated chemistry is about the only thing that gives you ability to repel oils. So if you've ever had a pair of Dockers, khaki pants, something like that you could spill oil on and it ran off, it had fluorochemistry on it. And so every oil repellent will also repel water. But every water repellent does not repel oil. So you can't just switch one out and expect to get the exact same performance. So that's one of the things. We started looking at these because they give you this property. I'll go through a little bit more here in terms of how they're put on and then the replacements that are being used now. So if you think of this as your fabric surface, the outer shell material, if you were to zoom in on that to a molecular level, this is what you end up having, is the kind of almost like a comb, a brush, where you have a flat surface and you have all these bristles standing up kind of. And what happens, if you can imagine a water droplet sitting right up here, I think of it kind of like a bed of nails, right? You can sit something on a balloon or something on there, it won't pop because there's just too many points. So the water droplets don't want anything to do with that PFAS finish. And these are what we call side chain fluoropolymers because you have a main polymer backbone with these side chains sticking off. Now you'll see this is very similar to this one. So when you see PFAS-free finishes now that are fully available, commercialized by different manufacturers, they're either this B or C. So what they've done is switch to either a hydrocarbon wax. So you think of anything, a candle, wax, doesn't really like water. That's the principle. So they've switched to this, using the same thing. These could be longer, shorter, just depends. Either that or they go to this, which is a silicone. And so you think of nonstick bakeware, things like that with silicone. Also repels some oils, water. And so that's the idea. Anytime you have a fabric that is water or oil repellent, it's got some version of these on there. And so when we start breaking this down, you see these fluorinated groups up top. That's what's giving you the oil repellency. You think about, if you look at this, the CH3, this is called a methyl group. These are the same thing, CH3s. Most oils are also hydrocarbons. Right? So when you look at gasoline, diesel fuel, motor oil, things like that, they're going to be very similar to those. And the whole principle of like dissolve, you're not going to repel them because they're going to be able to absorb into here. That's the reason you have to go to the fluorinated chemistry. It's exceptionally well at what it does. If you completely disregard any kind of health issues, it's great. It's really good at what it does. And so that's one version. That's the side chain fluoropolymers. The other place that you'll hear that PFAS are used in your gear are the moisture barriers. This polymeric form where we create a membrane And so this is where you see, this is our polymer form, PTFE. It's the same thing as Teflon. Teflon is just a name brand that DuPont trademarked. And so this is just an idea, like one of these would be a normal molecule, and then this is a giant chain that goes hundreds of thousands of units long. So that's the difference between the small and the long. So when you have your materials here, your outer shell to the inner layer, that moisture barrier, which is right behind the outer shell, it's really important that it blocks certain things, right? The moisture barrier is intended to block water penetration, mainly for a couple of things, but for one is for weight, so you don't soak in a ton of moisture, for physiological burden. It's also has bloodborne pathogen testing to make sure you're not getting any viral infections and things like that, other kind of biological fluids through. But the other thing, one of the biggest concerns we had about firefighters before the issue of cancer kind of became so prevalent was heat stress.
Do you have an idea that you can't quite get out of your head and onto paper? Does your department need updated shirts? If so, you need to talk to the guys over at Studio Print Shop. We've been working with the guys at Studio on making some of our ideas become reality. Whether you need screen printing, embroidery, or graphic design, they have you covered. They're even working with the latest direct-to-garment printing technology to make your ideas come true. Check out their link on our website or go to studioprintshop.com and get 10% off your first order when you use the discount code ALLCLEAR. Studio Print Shop, creativity fueled by passion and vision.
And heat stroke. And one of the things, the reason that these PTFE-based membranes started to be used about 20 years ago is because they gave you this ability to resist liquids of all types, but it was breathable. And what I mean by breathable is not air's not moving through there necessarily, but when you take PTFE, and they kind of found this out by accident almost, if you heat it up and you stretch it really fast, it creates pores. And I'll show you what that looks like, but it's a porous structure that these pores are, like I said, 2,000 or 20,000 times smaller than a water droplet. So the water sits on the surface. But then they are also larger, 700 times larger than a water vapor, a water molecule. So if you have a lot of humidity buildup inside the suit, what happens is this moisture vapor is allowed to escape through those pores and give you some relief from the heat stress. So they're one of the only ones that can really do that. The other alternatives are polyurethanes. There's a couple other types of things that are used in the European market, but they don't provide necessarily this combination. So that's why they became so prevalent. And like I said before, you have these huge molecules there. Give you a reference, so this molecular weight for a chain like this might be in the 10 millions. One molecule of PFOA is about a 400 to 500 molecular weight, so give you kind of a range. When we talk about these pores, so this is microscope images, and this is just zooming in each time on this square. This is a commercial moisture barrier that's in many turnouts right now. And you can just kind of see what I mean by that porous structure. So your water molecules will actually just kind of pop through here and diffuse through that to give you relief from that heat stress. These are also used in hazmat clothing, right? So you haven't heard as much probably about this topic in the hazmat community because you have no idea what you're going to be exposed to. And most people there want to have the highest level of protection possible because you just don't know. And so if you go to a less permeable barrier, a chemical protected barrier, these are the same magnification levels, and all they've done is the pore sizes are just smaller because you want to keep out as much as possible. So now you have, that's why hazmat suit materials are hotter. Right? They're not as breathable because the pore structure is not there, because you're sacrificing. The biggest thing you have to, anytime you're dealing with PPE, is the trade-offs. Everybody, it'd be great if we could give everybody every property you want and have none of the side effects, kind of, right? But that you have to understand those. Another place these chemicals are used are AFFF. So the AFFF putting out Class B fires, you'll hear a little bit of what was going on with that. But just to say that these chemicals, again, are very effective at what they've done. You can basically treat every Class B fire the same with this. You apply it the same way, puts it out. The reason you can't use water is because water is more dense than the oil, and the chemistry there, the oil is just going to sit on top and burn on top of the water. So you have to have something that basically creates a film to suffocate it. There are alternatives to this as well. I think the mil spec from the military just came out recently, basically speccing out non-fluorine foam or fluorine-free foam. I think they're going with another triple F acronym there, which is probably going to get confusing. But this stuff also used a lot and just kind of dumped. This is when I first got that email about the issues of PFAS and the fire service. I wasn't surprised to find fluorinated chemistry on the fabrics because anybody in the textile industry would know. I mean, even when I was going in classes at NC State, it was fluorinated chemistry if you need oil repellency. Right? We didn't look at it as PFAS. I don't even know the first time I heard that term, actually. But again, that was one of my first concerns with this stuff is just spread all over the ground, and then where does it go? Right? It goes into the groundwater, and then you have aerial contamination, which is a problem. So again, why have they been used? They've really been used, as I've said multiple times, because they're incredibly effective. Right? So let's take the exposure, the health risk aside apart for a second. They're very good at providing water and oil repellency. They're incredibly good at blocking things coming in, but also still being a breathable material. And they were very good at putting out really difficult to put out fires. So they were used, and like I said before, used and used and used. And they started getting used in so many different industries. Probably the majority of stuff in this room has PFAS on it. They're used, one of the biggest industries is not the textile industry, it's the electronics industry. That was one of the first places that PTFE was used as an insulation for wiring. Teflon tape. Anybody ever use Teflon tape? Right. It's PTFE. It's the polymeric form. So every plumbing connection in a house just about maybe has it. But they've been used in textiles, upholstery, carpeting, baby bibs. Actually, the moisture barriers and baby bibs are made in the same facility in Tennessee. So if you want that oil repellency there. They've been used in cosmetics. They've been found in a lot of places. I don't know if anybody saw recently, there was I think Coke is being sued because their Simply Orange juice had PFAS in it. So I would guess to say that they didn't put it in there. One of the problems is we've contaminated the world so much with these chemicals and they don't go away. It was probably in the oranges to begin with. There's people working at NC State looking at adsorption from soil, where it goes into plants, strawberries, lettuce, all types of things. So whenever you have chemicals, you never really get rid of them, right? Unless you can kind of design a process that's going to completely destroy them. They go somewhere. So even if after it gets out of wherever it's at, goes into the soil, gets picked up by the food, you eat the food, you get higher levels that way. So they're used everywhere. One of the things that I want to kind of break down real quick is this idea of or concept of essential use. And so when you look at essential use, this is a thought process that the European Union uses when dealing with hazardous substances. It's something that's being pushed a little bit more, specifically to PFAS. Basically, you have to ask two questions. If you have a hazardous chemical, is it necessary for health and safety and functioning of society? Is kind of the first thing there. And the other is, are there any available alternatives that are feasible economically, technologically, from that standpoint, that are acceptable? So you start asking those two questions, and when you can get kind of some different categories. So we think about in terms of PFAS, like I said, they've been used in so many different areas because they worked really well, right? They started putting them in everything. And so if we go to things like consumer textiles, outdoor apparel, your hiking jackets, things like that, biking or cycling jackets, you don't need oil repellency for that, right? So they're not really good for, or not needed for health and safety. They're not functioning in society. There are replacements. There are waxes and things like that where you can get that function there. So those are considered non-essential. One of the things that you'll hear hopefully pretty clearly is that all non-essential uses of PFAS need to be stopped immediately because we've, again, contaminated so much. Air, water, soil, it's a problem. When you go to the next one, you may have things that are needed for health and safety and functioning of society, but we've identified substitutable alternatives that are available. So the non-fluorine-free foams, different floor coverings, things like that. Something that we know we can now switch, right? So you switch. The last category here is if we determine that something is essential use, PFAS is an essential use in this category, it's because it's for health and safety, and we don't have anything to replace that performance. Now, it's highly possible that there are some applications that it's going to be deemed essential. When you start looking at where all these things are used, you'd be surprised how, there's I think 3M just said they're going to get out of making PFAS compounds, and they released a list of 15,000 of their compounds that have PFAS in them. Or they're not compounds, they're products. You know, everything from SCBA, parts, pieces, rubber gaskets, they're used everywhere. But if you can replace them, you replace them. Now, one of the things I'll say is if we determine that some specific use in firefighting is deemed essential, that should never be considered permanent. Because what that should do is tell us as researchers, working with manufacturers and whoever, that we have to develop a way to get around that. Because we don't need to continue using a hazardous substance if we can figure out something to get around it. So never consider that permanent and put that constant pressure to move forward. So for firefighting, we asked a couple of questions. So are PFAS essential to meet the performance standards? That's where we have to go to first. So I don't sit on the NFPA committee. I'm involved with them. We have people at NC State that are on the committee. The NFPA 1971 standard is being revised now. We are actually meeting in Durham the last week of February, first week of March, to look at all the public comments. If anybody wants information about that meeting, I can share it with you. It's open, whoever wants to be there. There's a lot of suggestions, a lot of inputs that have been put in about hazardous substances in gear, what tests we should do, what tests should be removed, what should we do, that kind of thing. So we have to look at the performance standards. If we say yes, we have to, it may be essential to meet those performance standards. Then we have to start asking the question, are the performance standards really in line with what firefighters need in the field? A lot of times when you develop performance standards, it's the best guess. And then they kind of fill in the gaps later. And so if the standards are not relative or not representative of what you actually need, we change the standards, then this may not be essential anymore. So that's another way, if we can't develop something, in the meantime, if we prove that you don't need this type of performance, we can replace it by changing the standards. So how do we assess the hazard? I'll go through this relatively briefly. I teach a class on impact of industry on the environment and society, where I pulled a lot of this from, and we look at risk assessment, risk management. And for risk, you have to have two things. There has to be a hazardous substance, and you have to have exposure to it, right? So you can have something that's the most hazardous thing possible, but if you're never exposed to it, you don't have a risk. Same way the other way. If you have a lot of exposure to something that's not hazardous, there's still no risk there. So we have to understand the risk, and one of the things I want to point out is this process that the EPA does for a human health risk assessment, where they identify the hazards. So what happens to a person when you're exposed to this, right? What are the health outcomes? This, for PFOA and a couple of other PFAS, was really determined by the C8 science and health panels that came out of the early DuPont litigation lawsuit. So they set up panels to do studies on this. But again, that was one or two, maybe a small handful of these compounds of over 10,000 different ones. It's hard to, like I said before, it's hard to chase and find out data on every single one. So you find out that, and then you start looking at dose responses. So how much do you have to be exposed to get a certain issue, a certain health outcome, right? You have exposure assessments, which I'll go into more, but this is looking at how are you exposed, what routes of exposure, what routes of entry into the body you have to look at. And then you pull all that together to say, here's a risk characterization so that you can then generate a management plan. So let's go into the assessment here. So what do we know about PFAS exposures? The NIEHS, part of National Institutes of Health, released a study a while back saying that it's believed that over 97 to 99% of Americans have some level of detectable PFAS in their blood. Like I said, we used it everywhere, and I mean everywhere. I remember as an undergrad, I was working at Cotton Incorporated in Cary. I was applying these chemicals to athletic wear, cotton shirts, because we wanted to make them absorb less moisture, make more comfortable. There was never even a mention of, are they hazardous? You never think about it. And so I've seen a lot of times where firefighters you can get blood tested, and you say, okay, well, I have detectable levels are 5 of the 7. Well, it's highly likely that the person right next to you, person lives in your same house, your neighbor, even if they're not a firefighter, they're probably going to have detectable levels as well. One of the things you have to think about with PFAS is it's so geographically dependent. Is anybody from the Wilmington coast area here? So Wilmington is kind of a hotbed. North Carolina in general is a hotbed of PFAS contamination and research. So there's everybody from UNCW, UNC, Duke, App State, ECU, us at NC State. Everybody's working on this issue because there's a lot of plants there, right, in the Cape Fear area. Chemours plants dumped stuff in the water. If you take a firefighter from Wilmington I can guarantee you is going to be much higher than national average. But you also have to compare that to people that live in Wilmington because there's contamination there. And so a lot of times you'll see comparison to this study, right, or this data set, which is the N-Haynes study. That's just the national average. It's done every couple of years. They select certain counties and things like that. One of the things I've been pushing for other researchers at the University of Miami, Arizona, things like that, is compare to the people that live around the firefighters. We don't necessarily know if you have higher levels or not. Because it's been kind of, as I say here, it's been a little all over the place. It was a study done by University of Miami, 2 Florida fire departments. All the firefighters on average had lower levels than the national average. But one of the things that they did do is they looked at it by varied job type. And while on average the rookies, the seasoned people, officers, engine operators, things like that, all had in that area for those 2 departments lower PFAS levels than national average, the fire investigators were much higher. So when I saw that, we'll talk later today hopefully about the fire investigator project, the first thing I thought of was fire investigators are at more scenes, they're there longer, and don't wear PPE. So the fire scene itself is another thing that we don't always and haven't looked at to this point. And for fire investigators to have much higher levels of PFOA and PFOS, there's something in their environment that is really important. I'm trying to see if, I don't know if Miami has published that study just yet. They showed it last December before last. And also, if anybody's interested, they do it's now the International Firefighter Cancer Symposium down in Miami at the end of February. It's a really good program. It's free. It's actually, there's a virtual option that's free if you want to go down to Miami in February. It's free to attend. You got to get the flights and everything. But so we'll be there with some of our research as well, take the students. But there's more to this. And one of the things getting to that point is this is probably what, if you've heard anything about PFAS, this is probably what you've seen or heard, right? You put the chemicals on the fabric, you wear the fabric, you get cancer. It's not that simple. I wish it was this simple because it would be a lot easier to solve the cancer issue in a fire service if it was this simple. You start looking at where you're exposed to all these things in addition to everything else you're exposed to. And we know, I don't know if everyone had heard, but back at last June, July, the International Agency for Research on Cancer updated its classification for firefighting as a known human carcinogen. That came up from possible. You have possible, probable, and known. And in the 10 or so years, the research that's been done made them completely skip the mid-step and say, yes, the occupation of firefighting is a known carcinogen. And I remember telling Arash when that came out, and I was like, I wish what they had said is that firefighting, the way firefighting has been done over the past 100+ years is a known carcinogen. It doesn't have to be. So if we understand the processes and can actually protect better without giving you unnecessary exposures to everything that's there, then maybe we can separate those 2 terms. So just to give you an idea of if you've got a piece of fabric, new, used, whatever it is, where are these things going to be found? So let's look at the intentionally added first, and I've already mentioned some of these to start with. We have those water and oil repellents, these side chain fluoropolymers, so that's one type that you would see. We go to the membranes. The membranes are also, those moisture barriers are not just PTFE. They have a coating on one side as well as PTFE, if you've worked with Teflon tape, is not structurally sound. So you have to have normally it's a Nomex backing fabric. That also can be coated with the repellents because when stuff comes through, the PTFE is actually on the inner side. You don't ever see the PTFE side. It's stitched into the thermal liner. So what you see if you separate your jacket, your outer shell, and your liner is the moisture barrier side that has the Nomex fabric. But that may have a repellent surface on it too. So those are intentionally added. But then we go to occupational exposures, and we start to see, like we mentioned before, we have foams. So your foams typically are going to be the sulfonated versions of these. Not every time. There's a lot of different versions and things like that. But if we're watching these things break down in the environment, a lot of times what you're going to get is things from foams are going to end up being PFOS or some version of that with a different chain length. So this is typically what you see, typically what we focus on. But we also have this one, the fire itself. I already told you previously, everything just about has some level of PFAS added for some property, almost every product. And so if we think about that for a second, we know that these structure fires are burning. Everything's burning in there. It has to be a source as well. And so just because there's PFAS on, and specifically used gear, it may be from the manufacturing, it may be occupational, it may be coming from the water that you wash it in. There's a lot of different sources, and it's not to negate any one of these or to minimize one or the other, but it's looking at the big picture, everything that's there. So this, I put a question mark here because we have no idea what's given off from the fires. I'm not sure if anybody's measured any of that. So we're trying to get some funding to be able to start doing that. I'm doing some work with UNC to look at in the station because one of the things, there's been studies looked at the in air in the station or in dust in stations, they've detected PFAS. I'm not surprised by that. One of the questions I had when that study came out was, did you measure for anything else? Because if you measured PFAS on the dust, I can guarantee you there's other carcinogens that are from the fire as well. We can't just focus on one thing if we want to separate, like I said, those two, firefighter and cancer. So there's a much bigger picture. Your job is incredibly difficult, incredibly hazardous, and that should not be minimized in any way. So I highlight these three because why would we focus on these? They're controllable, right? These are things that we're applying, and that's why there's been so much attention on the finishes put on the fabrics, on the moisture barriers themselves, on the AFFF. You can control those. You may not feel like you have much control over the fire scene, right? You do have control over what you do on the fire scene, though. And it may be that we have to start looking at, if you smell smoke, you should be on air. Respiratory protection is incredibly important, which I'll talk through here. The reason to show those is start looking at the routes of exposure. All right, so it's important to understand how you get exposed to chemicals, whether it's through ingestion, inhalation. Hopefully we won't have to worry about injection on the fire scene. But ingestion, inhalation, and skin or dermal absorption. Those are typically the routes that you look at, highly dependent on surface area. So if I do a lot of chemical exposures and hazmat clothing, things like that. Typically there, we're saying, okay, you got a SCBA on. If something gets into the skin, something permeates through the fabric, is it a large surface area, smaller surface area? That's going to determine how much gets in. The skin anatomy, where it's at on the body, will affect things. Respiratory, though, what are your lungs supposed to do? Right? They're supposed to transfer oxygen and carbon dioxide really efficiently. And so if you go down into the lungs, the lowest portion of the lungs, where that actually happens is probably a 1 or 2 cell thickness of that membrane. So those oxygen and carbon dioxide can transfer easily. If you ever have anesthesia, one of the first things they do is they give you gas because it's incredibly fast acting, because it has a very fast way to distribute things throughout your body. Right? So if you breathe things in, your respiratory system is one of the first things that you should always be concerned about protecting, whether that's PFAS, other chemicals, smoke, soot, whatever it is. Now, if you have smoke and soot, that could also roll into the ingestion route. It could get in your mouth, you could swallow, go into the gastrointestinal tract. So that's another way as well. The skin is actually another one that we look at. Skin is actually a pretty decent barrier in itself. We work a lot with our vet school at NC State, looking at dermal absorption of chemicals. Your skin on average human is 1.5 to 2 square meters. I think I had it up here. So the respiratory tract somewhere between 50 and 100 square meters. So if you were to open your lungs out and look at the surface area, it's about the size of a tennis court. So a much larger surface area than your skin, which is another reason why we protect that one first. But you also have different things, different layers of the skin. This also applies to when we're calculating burn injury, the first, second, third degree burns, as you're getting further into this anatomy of the skin. You also have hair follicles, sweat glands, things like that things can distribute into. But when we look at exposure pathways, the one I showed you earlier was wearing, the idea that you wear gear, dermal exposure, and it goes in the body. That would be this one right here. I don't know if this is an exhaustive list. It's just the one that I came up with, trying to think of every way you may be exposed. So everyone has environmental exposures. We have contaminated groundwater, and the I here is ingestion, D is dermal contact, R is respiratory. So contaminated groundwater, you can breathe it in, you can get on your skin. We have a group on campus that's measuring people in the Cape Fear region, looking at exposures. They looked at when they washed the water, the shower water, all kinds of stuff. So groundwater, air, and food. So the soil. There's also a study that's been done. It's a professor at UNC that used to be at NC State, looking at pine needles. They went back through at arboretums. They have samples of pine needles throughout history, and they tested them for PFAS, and they got a historical perspective in the state of North Carolina of when this stuff started to come in, because it absorbs into things. I don't know if that was necessarily from just the soil or could also absorb from the air. So, so again, this varies geographically, highly dependent on where you're at. So if you ever see data showing that firefighter rates or levels of PFAS in firefighters are elevated, one of the first questions to ask is how does it compare to the people around them? Because if we don't know that, we don't know if it's a geographical thing or if it's a job. There's a lot of information out there that you get parts and pieces of, right? And it's hard to put it all together. So when we think about PFAS finishes and membranes in the gear, so like I said, direct contact. So if you have treated fabric, you put it on, that could be a route. That's the one we typically think of. But you also have things that I'll show you in a moment. The finishes can degrade. And if they degrade chemically and they release, then you could be in the air, it could be off-gassing, exposed that way. Physical degradation, so anytime you're dealing with fabrics, you're going to have lint. And so this doesn't necessarily mean that the finishes are breaking down, it's just lint fibers are coming off and you could inhale those or ingest them that way. We go back to the AFFF, you have direct contact, if you get sprayed with it, you can have contaminated turnout gear. And when you anytime on these occupational ones, when you contaminate the gear, you go back through this process too, because any of these could happen at any point in time after you have it on there. Fire suppression, the actual scene. So building materials, off-gassing, combustion byproducts, contaminating the gear, contaminated release, physical lint in the station after the fact. It's complicated. That's all I want you to take from this, is that it's not a straightforward, just replace this and we're done. When we look at things, so this is one of the first studies that came out looking at PFAS on fabrics. This is Graham Peasley at Notre Dame, who, if you follow this topic, probably heard of. I feel like the ones we know the most about, and you can see he has a 2008 jacket that was unused. There's detectable levels in the thermal liner, moisture barrier, outer shell. It is important to note that some thermal liners also had PFAS finishes on them to limit moisture absorption, with the thought process of we don't want you to get too heavy wearing the gear for physiological burden. I don't know if they've stopped that, but 2014, so we had used jackets, unused. So there's just basically all you can take from this is, yes, there's PFAS on the gear. I wasn't necessarily surprised when I saw this because I knew they were applying these chemistries. But when you start looking into it, what is surprising is we have these small molecular weight compounds. And that's where we have some of the controversy, some of the disconnect between manufacturers and firefighters. So one of the things that we did is I took outer shell right off the roll, straight from the manufacturer, and we put it in, this is called a gas chromatograph, as a headspace sampler. So I can take a piece of fabric, I put it in a vial, and I can heat it up. And so we heated it to 150 all the way to 200 degrees C, let it sit at those for 15 minutes each. And a headspace is basically what volatilizes off of that. So at this, what I started doing was searching, right? And I start seeing this peak that every time I increased the temperature, it got bigger, meaning more of it is there, right? So when I start looking at this, I've identified this by searching for this. Let's call this as a fingerprint, a signature for a PFAS compound. One of the hard parts with analytical chemistry with PFAS is if you're not looking for it, you're not going to see it. If you're not specifically targeting them, you're not going to necessarily see them. So we were searching through and said, okay, this is a signature. Let me search for just that part, and that's where I got this peak. So where is this coming from? This is one of our polyfluorinated alkyl or fluorotelmer alcohols. Meaning that we have this fluorinated chain, we have hydrocarbon here, and an alcohol group. Remember this picture? If you cut that off right there, that's where it's coming from. So if you heat this up, when you get, and 200 degrees C in a fire on gear is easily attainable. We actually went in and measured it. And so what's happening is these fabrics are being heated up. This is a very weak linkage that can actually pop off. And so when that pops off, you get the fluorotelmer alcohol that can then further degrade into the PFOA, the final terminal unit. And so when this all started, we had Graham Peasley's work where there were these chemicals detected. And these can be different chain lengths, and that's where you get this is 8 carbon, this is 6 carbon. You have 4, you have 10. There's a lot of different versions. But with PFOA, PFHA, firefighters said, hey, we detected these in the gear. Well, the manufacturers came back and said, we did not put that on the gear. And the hardest part of this is they're both accurate, but neither is a complete statement, right? So manufacturers put this on, and they're told by the chemical company, and that's what it is, right? So they put that on, and for whatever reason, nobody ever really does a full risk assessment of actual use when we use chemicals and other types of things. So it's highly likely that this was the first time that anybody's actually measured this, that you heat this up, and this linkage, this bond breaks, and now you're releasing these things to wherever they're going to go. So one of the things, just sitting in, like I said earlier, sitting in between this two sides is very difficult. And I try to interpret for both sides. And from what I've been able to tell from the groups that are in the NFPA committee, the firefighters, the manufacturers, and it's also important to note there are manufacturers on the side of getting rid of this. There are firefighters on the side of keeping it as well. So it's not just a clear cut. I've actually stopped them in the middle of meetings before and said, you're both trying to apply what we call the precautionary principle. If we don't know, let's do the safe thing. From the firefighter side, we don't necessarily know how much you're exposed to from the gear, so let's be safe and remove it. From the manufacturer side, they said, we don't know what that's going to do. We don't want any unintended consequences by switching to something that we don't know how it's going to perform in the field, so we don't want to remove it yet. That's a debate that's, luckily, the heart of that conversation is the health and the safety of the firefighter, right? So they're both trying to get to the same place. It's just they're not speaking the same language sometimes, which is really difficult. So back to this, like I said before, why are we focusing on these? Because they're controllable. We can replace these. We have the fire suppression, exposure route. And if we're having things that are giving off-gassing, the vent lint and other type of stuff, we may have to look at more policies on scene, right? If we determine we can't get rid of these, even if we get rid of these, the structures are still there. All the consumer products are still in the buildings. So if you have PFAS-free gear, it may be PFAS-free the first time you wear it into a fire. You still have to be aware of on-scene decon, cleaning efficiently, being very careful. Everything you hear about not wearing your gear if you don't have to, all that kind of stuff applies to PFAS, but it also applies to everything else that we know comes off of that fire. I forget who it was, but it was a firefighter that made the mention of we've created a very efficient process of taking contamination from the scene and bringing it back to the station, right? So that goes for any chemical. So moving forward, what do we have? This is where you have to understand the trade-offs, what's being put out there now. And so what research is needed, this is actually a study that came out at the end of 2021, 2022. So we need a formal exposure assessment. Is the turnout gear a significant source? What are the other sources? Dermal absorption. A lot of people haven't even looked at the volatile PFAS that we measured coming off the fabric. They were so focused on the other ones, the PFOA and things like that. They're not even looking at the volatiles. So this study showed that there's a lot more volatile chemistry there. NIST has the National Institute of Standards and Testing or Technology has a mandate to work in this area, federal mandate. They should have a report out coming soon where they've looked at, and they made a presentation to the NFPA committee. They found those fluorotelmer alcohols. They found another version that's coming off of the fabric was kind of the highest one that they saw. We're continuing to look. That was all outer shell. Arjun and I are trying to look at moisture barriers, thermal liners, other types of consumer products to put things in perspective as well. Not to just look at the fire service industry, but other types of products. This, like I said before, we a lot of times we test things right off the shelf. They're good. You move on. We can't do that. We have to look at things under UV weathering. UV light is very damaging to gear, right? So if your gear is sitting in the engine bay with the door open, I can guarantee you have to do more repair on that one if it's constantly seeing the sunlight. Because it will break down the materials. It will break down the chemistries as well. Repeated heat cycles, laundering cycles. Arjun will show you, laundering is one of the hardest things for the gear to face. You would think the fire was the worst thing. The washing machine can be the worst thing to that gear because of the agitation, because of the mechanical abrasion. It breaks things down. And then these trade-offs. So let's look at those. We have two projects right now that we're looking at. The first one I'll talk about is a little bit more on the exposure side. So what trade-offs do we get? How are you potentially being exposed? The other is on the performance side. So we can't negate either of these. We have to look at both of them. So on the exposure side, one of the things we talk about are PFAS dermally absorbed. I can't tell you that. There's only about 1 or 2 studies that have looked at one compound, not the whole class, not every possible condition. And so all I want to show here is that the study that you'll see reported most times when you see people say that PFAS is dermally absorbed is this one by Franco, is the author's name. And so they put PFOA on mice skin and human skin at a pH of, I think, 2.5. And they measured a fair amount coming through. A lot of times, if someone gives you an article, read the whole article. Definitely get through the whole thing. And the second half of that paper, they did it at a pH of 5.5. They got a 1,000-fold decrease in the amount absorbed in human skin. That's important because the value, we call it a pKa, but what you're doing is you're either ionizing or unionizing that compound. And at the low pH, it's ionized, which means that it's more hydrophobic. It's more similar to fats. It can easily go into the skin. But where PFAS typically sit, PFOA in general, it's going to be more in an ionized state, which changes its absorption, which is why it's decreasing. So we're starting to look at this with our vet school. Like I said before, we're doing dermal absorption. We've done PFOA, PFHXA, and PFBA. This is a 8-carbon, 6-carbon, and 4-carbon variety. Because when they start outlawing the 8-carbon, manufacturers switch to the 6. When you start saying the 6 is a problem, they switch to the 4. This is why you can't keep chasing chemicals. So these are the things that you would typically find breaking down from the gear. This side, we're still working on being able to get these chemicals to be able to test with, but that would be more on the foam side. So we want to see if you're exposed to those, do they get absorbed? So we're trying to do it at relevant conditions. So we have a synthetic sweat that's a pH about 4.5. 37 degrees C is about the highest temperature your skin's going to get. There's studies that have done that at Illinois Fire Service Institute, looking at firefighter after a session response. And so we're trying to do it at an elevated temperature. We're using pig skin or porcine skin as well as a skin surrogate that we're working with. The idea is to take that fabric, put it in contact with the skin, and see if we get anything. Does anything come through? Because it has not been done. There's no study out there right now that can tell you this is how much PFAS you're exposed to dermally from wearing fabric. We're also going to do this not just with the outer shell, because you don't wear the outer shell next to your skin necessarily. We're going to do it with the moisture barriers. We're going to do it with the thermal liners and see. Because we need to know, right? We can't write off any of this. It's all an exposure. It all adds up. The other thing we're doing is for the NFPA committee, trying to figure out, can we do a leaching study? So if we take your fabric and we put it in synthetic sweat for a 24-hour period, worst case scenario, elevated temperature, sweat condition, what comes off, right? We're going to do that in the new state and the aged state. So those are hopefully coming out. We got to the end of the year to do some of the skin studies, so those reports hopefully be coming soon. Performance trade-off side for our FEMA-funded project, we have aging everything. So we have different fabrics with all the different finishes. We have unfinished fabric. One of the hardest parts of this has been chasing down all the fabrics, being able to get rolls of them. The manufacturers have, when I first proposed this, I went to the firefighters and I went to the manufacturers and I said, I can't do this project unless you're all bought in, because frankly, I'm going to tick off somebody with whatever I find. And I have to know that you're all on board, that we're doing this right. We're doing it as scientifically unbiased as we possibly can and looking at all angles. And so we're including cycling of UV, heat exposure, mechanical action, laundering. And then we're going to go to Illinois Fire Service Institute. We're going to take our new fabrics, our aged fabrics. We're going to put them through. They have what they call a fire exposure simulator. They have a standard couch. They bought a ton of Ashley Furniture couches of the same model. They put it in the middle, and the smoke is directed out the two sides. They get very repeatable conditions when they do that. So this was actually developed as part of an AFG grant as well. And so we're going to do multiple cycles there because we have a lot of questions in terms of the contamination that picks up, how easy these things are to clean. So Arjun's going to help us continue looking at the cleaning efficacy. We want to focus last here, in the minutes that I have here, looking at one specific question. So I mentioned before, the biggest thing we know is when you switch to a PFAS-free finish, you're going to lose repellency of oil, right? So how many of you have been exposed to hydraulic fluid or gasoline, diesel fuel, motor oil, any other flammable solvent? That's what we can't just negate that. We have to look at it because, yes, you need repellency for oil or water. You have to have that repellency to the oils, bloodborne pathogens, things like that. We have to look at those. Those are more similar to water. So the question is, if we get rid of this repellency, now we have a flammability concern that's a trade-off that we have to be aware of. So we're looking at this. What level exposure? Do we do a splash? Do you soil it in? You can defeat any finish if you put pressure behind it and force that material, that chemical, in between the fibers. You're not actually saturating it. You're just pushing it in between the different fiber surfaces. And I'll show you what that looks like. But the type of threat, is it a direct flame? You don't see direct flame every single time you go in. You see radiant heat every single time. So is that a difference? Do we have an immediate exposure? Is it an extended time? Is it, you get exposed to hydraulic fluid and the next day you go to another scene? Is that a problem? If you clean it, does it come out, right? So one of the ways we're doing this, and hopefully these videos play pretty well here, is that this is called a splash test. It's a 45-degree angle. We're going to put 10 mils. I'll get all three of these to play. So we have water, diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid. This is unfinished fabric, so it shouldn't repel anything. This should be worst case scenario. So the water here, you can see it absorbs. The diesel fuel is very difficult to repel. It's a very low surface tension. Hydraulic fluid is a little bit more viscous, so not as much of it absorbs. So if you didn't have any finish, this is how you would be performing. Let's go to why these chemicals were used to start with. So PFAS treatments, this is what you're you're used to. You can see the water running off there, the hydraulic fluid, you can see it running off, or the diesel and the hydraulic fluid. This is why they're used. They're very effective. Like I said before, if you if you ignore any of the health conditions, you get incredible properties, but you can't ignore it. So when we start looking at the hydrocarbon wax, this is one of the commercial finishes, PFAS-free finishes that's out there. So let's look at the water repellency first. Like I said before, you can get water repellency other ways. You absolutely can. We go to the diesel fuel and the hydraulic fluid, it's not the case. So this is commercially finished, straight off the roll, absorbing. Right. That may or may not be realistic. It may not be exactly what you're going to see every single time. But one of the problems when we set performance requirements for gear is we don't set for what happens every day. We have to set for something that can happen. And so you have to look, and the performance requirements in the FPA give you the minimum protection required. Manufacturers can exceed that, but we have to set the bar somewhere and say, if we deem, and like I said before, this needs to be looked at, if firefighters deem this as a potential hazard, we have to be able to set a requirement for that. So what does this mean? So we took these, we let them sit for 24 hours. Say you got exposed and you didn't wash your gear, you just went back and the next day you went to a fire. This is a vertical flame test. It's kind of hard to see. Here's the flame burner here. The fabric is a rectangle right there. So if you have traditional PFAS treated fabrics and you burn those with no chemical added to them, no splash or anything, that's what you should experience. This test can be done, it's typically done. We splash that with hydraulic fluid, let it sit again for 24 hours. Flame goes out. Right? This is what you're used to. So when we go to the alternative finishes, one of the things I want to show first, again, no chemical exposure. So the PFAS chemistry gives you really not much of anything in terms of flammability resistance. So I've heard that as well in some stories and things. They're not there to give you flame resistance. The materials themselves are inherently flame resistant. It's built into the structure. The Kevlars, the Nomex, the PBIs, those materials don't burn. So when we splashed this treatment with hydraulic fluid, you saw that it soaked in before. One of the things you'll notice, it's hard to see, there's fire on the back of that sample too. And so it's burning on the face, it's burning on the back. So what's typically behind that fabric? The moisture barrier. So that fire would be in between the layers of the garment potentially. This is not a reason for us to not think about how to replace PFAS, but it's something we can't discount either. It's absolutely something that can happen. Now, if we go and we look at, like I said before, you can make this happen on C6 treated, the PFAS treated fabrics as well. So again, I'll play both of these. This one we splashed it on. This one you could assume, let's say it's you were laying down under a car, getting somebody out, laid in hydraulic fluid, or knelt down in a puddle of it. You can make the same thing happen, but there is a level of pressure, of force that has to go into that to make it happen. If you're just splashed with it, it's not going to happen. So these are trade-offs. And so when we talk about trade-offs, it's not to say that, we're trying to justify one or the other. It's just something you have to know because this is something you have to train on. You can't just give firefighters PFAS-free fabrics and not say anything. And that's one of the areas that I think that the firefighters, the union, things like that have started putting this, pushing for the PFAS-free gear. I haven't heard anything about make sure you understand the trade-offs. Make sure you are training your people appropriately. I know the manufacturers, they know this. They've told people that it's not going to absorb moisture. I was talking to some last week or 2 weeks ago at the Fire Department Safety Officers Symposium. And they said they have it. If you get PFAS-free treated fabrics, check the user manual. There's probably a line in there that says this does not repel oil anymore because they know it can be a problem. But if this is what firefighters want, that's what they're making. You have to train. So these main takeaways as I finish up here, PFAS chemistry has been used in a lot of different things, but in firefighter gear to provide these really high levels of performance that may or may not be replaceable. There's work going on to try to find replacements for the finishes. There are barriers that you could potentially use that are used in Europe. If you switch to those, you have to understand the trade-off of breathability and heat stress. Do we start seeing higher levels of cardiac events and things like that in firefighters at that point? Again, you have to train, and it's not just training and telling somebody, it's acclimating them to the new gear as well. So I reiterate, all non-essential uses of PFAS must be removed and prohibited as soon as possible. That's across the board, all industries. If it's not for health and safety, and if there's a replacement, we do not need to use it. We've more than loaded our world with PFAS everywhere. So firefighters are exposed to PFAS through multiple exposure routes. It's not just a simple, this one thing is the problem. There's a lot of parts, a lot of pieces. So to oversimplify it, I feel like it's difficult. It is. It's just, it doesn't do the job that you do service, the hazard that you go into, it doesn't do it service to say it's this one specific thing. So more research needs to be done there. Moving to these PFAS-free alternatives, you have to train, you have to ask the questions, what's going to be different? And many times right now, the manufacturers may not be able to tell you because they don't know themselves. That's why we're doing this project. We're looking at the cleaning efficacy. We're looking at what leaches out. We're looking at what breaks down over time. It may be that, if you got 5-year-old gear, maybe it doesn't even repel at all anymore anyway, right? So it may not be an issue down the road. But from day one, I can tell you the PFAS-free finishes are not going to repel those oils as opposed to over time with it wearing off. Lastly, the PFAS in the fire service is a complicated issue. It doesn't have a single solution. But we have to continue pushing forward for newer, safer chemistries, materials. We have to be able to give you the performance that you need without unnecessary health risks. There's a lot of things to balance there. And I don't know if the chemistry, the technology, the materials are out there right now, but that doesn't mean we should give up. We got to keep pushing forward, finding those new materials, finding new chemistries to help get you what you need. One of the things, and I've got all of these links that you'll be able to access, but I have this QR code will lead you to a sign up. I'm trying to get our website set up so we can direct people there. If you don't get this one, it's on a thing at the end that I'll give you. One other thing to mention, I've gone through a lot of this today, but if you want to share it with anybody, this is a QR code for a webinar on this very topic that I did for a group that's called the Science Alliance. It actually stands for Science to the Station. It's a lot of researchers that know much more than I do about exactly what they're doing as well in many different areas: health and safety, emotional health, mental health, exposures. So if you want to join this, you can use my last name. There's a link there. I also have the other QR code. This will take you to the webinar. I got another QR code for this. But they send out quarterly newsletters with all the different research topics, research papers that have come out, a couple other things that may be happening. They're going to do a symposium in Tucson in November, which we just kind of did one of these in St. Pete Beach, Florida. It was all the FEMA researchers. I was honored myself to be up there. I told them, I feel like a second generation FEMA researcher because I've grown up working on these projects and citing the people that went before me that day. So, and then I like to end on a video of our pyro head at NC State. And so there's a video there.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation of PFAS in the Turnout gear presented by Dr. Bryan Ormond from NC State University. As always, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave us a message at info@ncfirefightercancer.org, or you can contact me directly at t.mcgaha@ncfirefightercancer.org. And until next time, be safe.